Hello and welcome. In this lecture I want to talk about reading input from the keyboard. This is a basic concept that I wanted you guys to learn early because it's very valuable and a lot of programs take input. So I provided this early on. Some of the concepts are not going to be completely clear, but we'll definitely learn these concepts in other sections as we go through. But it's important to learn this very early. And it's very similar to the printf function. So we've discussed output. We know how to format output using printf. We now have to learn a little bit about input, getting input from the user essentially. It's very useful to ask the user to enter data into a program. We talked about command line arguments, entering data via that way. That's one way to do it. Another way is to ask the user directly so that they can type something in the keyboard. So you get the input from the keyboard, but it gets displayed. You enter the input via the terminal, the console. That's how you enter the input. The C library contains several input functions. We're going to use scanf. That's the most generic function. It's very useful. It provides the most different formats that you can enter. So you can enter text and then it will get converted to the different formats. So scanf reads the input from the standard input stream. That's standard in. Scanf can actually be used for reading from files as well, if the input stream is a file, but we're not going to worry about any of that for now. We're just going to use it to read input from the keyboard. Okay, and so standard in by default is the keyboard. Standard in is a stream. Streams in C, there's three different streams: the error stream, standard in, and standard output. Standard in by default is the keyboard. So we're going to keep it that way, and using scanf, it's going to read from standard in, and then based on what you enter, or how you want to store the data, I should say, it's going to convert what you entered, because what you enter is going to be text. It's going to convert that text to the format that you provided. So it's going to use format specifiers, just like the printf function. So the format can be a sequence of characters, which is called a string. We haven't studied that in a lot of detail yet, but again, we will when we talk about data types. And then also, you can specify other data types that we're going to talk about, such as integers, numbers, basically. So you can read numbers, you can read strings, you can read numbers that contain decimals, single individual characters, all this nice stuff. If the standard is input from the keyboard, which is default, what's going to happen is as you type in text via the keyboard, it's going to take that text, put it into the C program, and it's going to convert that text. And text is things like letters, digits, and punctuation. So even though you're typing in a number, it's still text because it's coming from the keyboard. So if you enter the integer 2014, which is a number, and you type essentially what's happening is you're typing characters 2, 0, 1, and 4. And what will happen is it will send that input to the C program. And if you want to store that data as a number, then you're going to have to convert that data. And so you have to specify the format specifier how you want to convert it, just like you do in the printf. Remember, like with printf, you used %d to print an integer. You would convert the text to an integer using %d as well for scanf if you wanted to convert the string to a number. And that's what we're going to do for basics early on. We're just going to use numbers because we know numbers so far and we haven't really learned about strings yet. So we're going to mainly use numbers when we input. So scanf, it's very similar to printf, but instead it is a little different in certain arguments that it takes. It still uses a control string followed by a list of arguments. So there's going to be something in those double quotes. The double quotes typically will only contain one thing, and it will be the format specifier, how you're going to convert the data. So the control string indicates the destination data types for the input stream of characters. It's that format specifier. %d, %c, %s, %f for float, and so forth. The printf function uses variable names, constants, and expressions in its arguments, right? Because we learned that. You have something in double quotes, and then inside the double quotes, you use format specifiers, and then after the commas, you can print out variables, or you can even print out expressions. Expressions we'll talk about in more detail as well, something that essentially returns a value. Most common type of expression is an arithmetic expression. The scanf function is different because instead of actually displaying variables, it's going to use variables that are pointed to. But luckily, pointers is a big concept in C. You don't have to know anything about pointers in order to understand and use the scanf function. So don't worry about that. All right. All you have to do is you have to remember 3 rules about the scanf function in order to use it. It's going to return the number of items that it successfully reads. So this is, if it reads 1 variable, 2 variable, 3 variables, it will return that. If you use scanf to read a value for one of the basic variable types that we're going to discuss, such as the int, the float, the double, then all you have to do is the variable name as the argument has to be preceded with an ampersand. Right? You don't even need to know why that is right now, but just do it. Any of the basic data types. Ampersand is address, and because scanf takes a pointer, you have to dereference, you have to pass in the address. The third thing that you have to remember for scanf, if you use scanf to read a string, which is a sequence of characters, into a character array, you don't have to use the ampersand. So basically, scanf takes two arguments, which I'm going to show you an example. The first argument is going to be how to convert the data that you type in. And if you store that data in int, you use format specifier %d. If you want to store it in a string, which we haven't learned about yet, you use %s. And then the second argument is, and it could be many arguments depending on how many format specifiers you use, because just like printf, would be the actual variable, the variable name. And if the variable is everything but a string, you just use the ampersand. Otherwise, you don't use the ampersand. Scanf function also uses whitespace to decide how to divide the input into separate fields. And whitespace includes new lines, tabs, and spaces. And again, I'll go through an example to show you what that means. Because just like printf can display many, many variables, depending on how many format specifiers you have inside the single quotes, same thing with scanf. If scanf has multiple things inside the double quotes, it will read multiple inputs. And the inputs are going to be divided by new lines. So again, scanf, if you want to try to understand what scanf is, it's the opposite of printf. Right? Printf is going to convert integers, floating point numbers, characters, strings, all these different data types, and it's going to convert it to text so that you can see it output. And it's going to be displayed on the screen. Scanf is the opposite. It's going to take as input text and convert it to any of the different data types like ints, floats, and doubles. So let's look at an example. This is an example of a simple program. We know what the main routine is. We know what the include directive is. We haven't learned about characters and integers yet, but basically at the very top of that main function, we're creating two variables because we need to store the data. And we're going to talk about variables in much more detail. But just like the printf function, again, you're just doing the opposite. So here we're displaying output to the screen saying enter a value. Scanf inside the double quotes has format specifiers to read in the input. And so you have to specify the data that's going to be read in. Here it says %s, %d. What that means is we're reading in a string, then we're reading in an int. And you'll notice that the string doesn't have the ampersand in the scanf after the first comma. And after the second comma, we have an ampersand because that's an integer. We're reading in a number. And then the printf is displaying output. So it's saying you entered in this string in this integer, just like we know what printf does. And then the main function returns a 0. All right, so let's go through this example in a second in code blocks. But let's just, again, reiterate a couple concepts. When a program uses scanf to gather input from the keyboard, it waits for you to input some text. So the program is actually going to pause until you enter the data. And then once you enter some text, and if you enter some white space, if you're entering in multiple things, then the program proceeds and reads the input. Once you actually hit the enter button, you have to hit the enter button. Again, scanf expects input in the exact same format that you provided. So if you say %s and %d, that means you have to provide a string followed by a space, any number of spaces, followed by an integer, a number, and a word. Right? String is a word, integer is a number. So let's go through this example line by line in code blocks. Okay, so here we have our main function. And again, it's important to be able to enter data into a program. So just like the printf, it's going to be very similar. And we don't have to understand all of this code. And we'll even get rid of the parameters that are being passed. It's a simple main function. We don't have to understand all this code. We don't even have to understand what variables are at this point. But variables will store data. In the example, we're creating a string array of 100. And with a semicolon, and then we're also just going to create an integer. Just like in printf, we have an integer, but we're using a string. I just want to demonstrate different inputs. Then, usually before you call the scanf function to get input from the keyboard, you're always going to tell the user something. You want to tell them what to enter. So printf, remember, displays data to the screen. We're just going to say enter a value. And they're going to actually enter a couple. And then we end it with a semicolon. We have to tell the user to enter something. Now here's where we use the scanf function. We say scanf, and then inside the parentheses, the first argument inside the double quotes is going to be data that we're going to read. So in this example, let's just say we're only going to read one input, %d, which is an int. And then we're going to store that data in a variable because we want to look at it. And it's going to be I. Now we have to specify the ampersand before that because remember this little trick with pointers. You don't have to know why, it's just the address. So that scanf on line 17 is going to actually read data from the keyboard until the user hits the enter button. And then that data is going to be stored in a variable called I. So now we just want to print what we entered. So here we're just going to say, we're going to add a line feed so it's readable. So we're going to use our escape sequence \n, and we're going to say you entered %d, and we're going to display the value of the variable. And we're also going to put a line feed after. So the value of the variable that we want to display is I. We're going to end it with a semicolon, and then that's our program. So again, printing output, asking for a value, reading input line 17, specifying that the data that we're reading is an integer, storing it in I using an ampersand, and then printing out what we just entered. So let's build this, and let's run it. And you'll see the program starts, and then it pauses because it wants you to enter a value. It says enter a value. So at this point, I have to enter a number that it can convert to a string, right? Because that's what's happening. So here, I'm just going to say 56, right? And then I'm going to hit enter. It ran twice because of my virus scanner. So just, I'm going to say 56 and then enter. And then it prints out I entered 56. So I was able to enter information, number, and it stored it in a variable. Now, as just like printf, you can actually have them enter multiple things and store in multiple variables. So here, after they enter an integer, I'm going to say another percent format specifier, %s, which means I want them to enter a string, which is just a word. So here, remember, if it's a word, I don't have to provide the ampersand, so I'm just going to say stir. I want to store that data in the variable store. And again, we'll learn about variables. And then I'm going to just print it out. And I added another variable, so you know that printf, and I'll just put colons before it. You also have to specify the format that you're printing. So there, %s. So hopefully that's clear. I'm now going to read in two inputs separated by spaces, store them in two variables, I and stir, and then display them. So now if we build and we run, so here I'm going to enter a number, 22. I'm going to hit space, and then I'm going to enter my name. And then I'm going to hit return. When I do that, the program is going to unpause, and it's going to display the number I entered and then the string. So it displays 22 in JSON. So this is how you can get input from the user. Simple, 4 or 5 lines of code. And again, this is useful because some of our challenges will want you to get input from the user. And in order to do useful things and learn different concepts, we should be able to get input from the user. So I hope this helped. And again, don't worry about some of these concepts that you're not fully understanding, things like variables and strings. We're going to discuss all that in a lot of detail. Thank you.